Joining. This is Michelle Savage with XBRL US. You are here for our webinar on Inline XBRL for small reporting companies and foreign private issuers, session 2. If we can go to our next slide, I'm going to walk through the agenda that we're going to cover. We're going to start off with a little discussion between Evan Condren. Evan is CPA Senior Product Manager at Certant. Evan has been working with filers since 2010 to adopt and optimize XBRL and Inline XBRL in quarterly and annual filings. Evan currently participates on 2 XBRL US working groups, the Regulatory Modernization Working Group and the Earnings Subcommittee. Evan's going to lead us in a conversation with Pranav Ghai. Pranav is co-founder and CEO of Calcbench. Pranav has a background in applied mathematics and more than 2 decades of experience working in the capital markets at ITG and at TIAA. He was a vice president for modelware and quantitative and derivative strategies at Morgan Stanley. Pranav is a board member of XBRL US and is on the Technical Computing Advisory Board for Microsoft. He's also a member of the CFA Institute's Corporate Disclosure Policy Council, which addresses issues affecting the quality of financial reporting and disclosure worldwide. So we're very happy to have both Evan and Pranav with us today. After they carry us through their discussion, we're going to cover a couple of CPE questions, and then we're going to go straight into a conversation with Stephen Horowitz. Stephen is Manager of Technical Services and Web Applications at NovaWorks. NovaWorks is a long-standing member of XBRL US, and Steve has 10 years experience working with XBRL and with the SEC's Edgar system. Steve is going to walk us through new features of the instance document, building on what he discussed during last week's webinar, which hopefully you all attended. He's going to talk about transformations and dimensions. He's going to cover tagging the 10Q cover page, changes to the Edgar filer manual, and then talk about some best practices that people should be following as they start working towards Inline XBRL. We'll then cover a couple of final CPE questions. So for those of you getting CPE, please make sure that you respond to the polls that will appear on the screen. And as we go through the presentation, if you have any kind of technical issues, please send us an email at support@xbrl.us, and we'll do our best to get you back online. Also, as we walk through the presentation, please feel free to send us questions by clicking on the Q&A link that you see on your console. You can just type the question in there, and we'll take them as we come in or at different points during the presentation. With that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to Evan and Pranav to talk to us about investors and XBRL data. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome to our audience. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to listen to our discussion and learn more about Inline XBRL. So first, Pranav, where do institutional investors get financial data?
Thanks for the question, Evan. You can hear me, yes? I think I took myself off mute.
Yes, we can hear you.
Good. So institutional investors typically get financial data from data aggregators, and people have heard of the household names, Capital IQ, Bloomberg, FactSet's another aggregator, and a lot of them get it from Calcbench too. Yeah.
Excellent. And given your years of experience at ITG and Morgan Stanley, can you explain how commercial data services collect and provide corporate data to institutions prior to the XBRL mandate in 2009?
Sure. So back in the old days, the way that a lot of firms would collect the data, and I mean, so go back a long time ago, people would have to book appointments to go to the SEC archive room and like pull out the documents, right? You fast forward a little bit, things became available through data feeds. And so in the 90s and the early 2000s, you could go to one of these aggregators and get information. But the way that they did it was they had armies of people that were offshore that were literally hand typing this stuff in. So the document would come out, they would get it, and they have a process where, people would literally key this stuff into databases, and then it was potentially, there were potential human errors in that data, and you had to wait, right? So there was wait time involved.
Okay. And in terms of small cap versus large cap, what do you see the differences in how this data is typically handled?
So when someone asks me that question, I have sort of this terrible answer that I'd eventually like to crowdsource. So if people have a better way of describing it, I'm all open to it. I tell people we're size agnostic at Calcbench. And what that means is it doesn't matter whether, Alphabet, Facebook, Microsoft, Exxon Mobil, whoever it is, files, or whether it's one of the smaller companies that file, we ingest as soon as it comes in. So the modern view of the world ought to be, it's just data that then gets processed so that clients can use it. The fact that it's a large company or a small company shouldn't matter. It's all processed, and machines can process this stuff very, very quickly. Whereas if we go back to our old model and contrast that to the old days, the large cap companies, the Apples of the world, you would get their data really soon, really quickly. But if it was anything outside the Dow or maybe outside the top 100 of the S&P 500, you'd have to wait. Now it's not the case anymore. It's lickety split. It's really quick. Same day.
Yeah. So it seems like timeliness is really the critical component there.
It is one of the critical components. Yeah. Along with the depth of the information you can get.
And what is Calcbench?
So we are we are a data aggregator. We gather information as it comes in, and we ingest it, database it, and then let our clients ask questions of that data. So we are sort of a modern. We're a modern day version of sort of a capital IQ, because we can retrieve and access information very, very quickly so that clients can get that as soon as they want.
And what kind of companies use Calcbench?
We have all kinds of users from across the spectrum. We have regulators as users. We have corporates. We have corporate clients, so people from the office of the CFO use it. We have traditional money managers. We have hedge fund managers, really data intensive types. And then we have a bunch of different research teams across different organizations that use Calcbench to access information. And then the last group that is sort of, in many ways the most interesting is the business schools use Calcbench to teach. So we sort of have we believe in the farm system model here. So we've got our AAA people, and AAA means something in accounting, but what I mean is the Major League Baseball farm system. We've got our AAA people who are going to go up to the majors, and they're out there learning Calcbench now. And so this thing is all feeding into, we're getting people out there who are using XBRL based financial statements, and they're getting more and more facile with it. And they won't go back to the old way. That's the good news.
Yeah, and can you describe a little bit what kind of analysis they're doing now that they have XBRL data as opposed to before they had XBRL data?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different things. The first, to me, the most basic view of the world is that this information comes to the users as the companies filed it. So you don't have an intermediate. I mean, we are an intermediary, right? But we give you the information as it was filed by the company. So we don't make it fit a template or anything like that. You can get literally as filed information. So that's the first thing. And if you talk to people in the business, they'll tell you that that's really critically important. The second thing is the ability to go into the footnotes of an organization and pull out just a single data point, and then maybe say, what does that data point look like across a larger group of companies? So if you wanted to, a very quick example would be when you look at the purchase price allocation that sits inside a business combinations footnote, you can learn about, you can ask a question that's very deep in the acquisition space. Things like, well, what are companies in the software space paying for intellectual property and patents? You can ask that question and get a very reasonable answer very, very quickly. And that's something that years ago, you'd have to literally dig through these statements in order to get, your answer. Now you can do it in seconds to minutes. So these are the kinds of things you can do. And these are the kinds of things that people are actually doing today. So,
yeah, so it sounds like the ability to drill down, slice and dice the information, however you need to analyze the data, and do it in a very quick manner is probably a good way to summarize it.
That's right.
And I mean, in terms of smaller reporting companies, do you see any type of analysis that's being done specifically for smaller reporting companies?
So the answer there is we see people doing things across the entire universe of companies. So the things that we consider, I'm very close to this, so I see sort of things that people are doing, and I just consider them sort of routine. And when you talk to somebody who's maybe a step or two removed from that process, like a user, they'll start telling you things like, look, I couldn't even get the income statement for small companies until 3 or 4 weeks after they reported. You guys give it to us within a day. That's big. And then they were just talking about the income statement. Now they're, things like, well, the segment disclosure. I can see what products are salient or relevant to these companies, and I can see it quickly. I can see it across time. So again, it's an efficiency play with respect to that. You're getting more information and you're getting it quickly or more rapidly than you were before. Same analogy.
And I think one thing that we wanted to showcase on this webinar, a lot of us represent the XBRL preparation side, and so we thought it might be helpful to show our audience kind of a couple examples to really showcase some of the comments that Pranav has mentioned in this discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and change it over to you, Pranav, and you can showcase a couple examples for us.
Terrific. I'm just going to jump right in. So I'll start sharing my screen here. So, Evan, you can still hear me, right?
Yep.
Okay.
And we can see your screen.
Okay, you can see my screen? Terrific. So this is Calcbench. If you're not familiar with it, please, come and visit us online, sign up for a free trial, whatever you want. Send us an email. What I'm going to show you very quickly, first of all, there's a lot here, and I don't want to overwhelm people with all of these different little things that we can do. But we are supposed to focus on smaller companies for this presentation. So what I'm going to do is typically I start by looking at a large company and showing people as filed information, and then I move through. I'm not going to do that today. But if you'd like to see that done, again, get in touch with us and we're happy to do that. I'm going to go right to our multi-company screening tool, which is right there. And it's going to load up and it's going to ask me a couple of questions, or I'm going to get some data back. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come into this choose companies section. I'll show you how easy this is. You can choose companies from a number of ways. You can just pick sort of one of these sort of homemade indices, or actually not homemade, but these are real things. Or you can come in and say, look, I want to find peers for a particular company. You can search SIC sectors. So I'm just going to go in and say, I want to find all the peers for the company Pfizer. Click there. Pfizer, of course, is a large cap company. You're going to get 930 firms here. But now what I want to do is I actually want to screen this group, and I want to shrink it. So I want to say, I'm going to click a few buttons here. I'm going to say, give me all companies in Pfizer's peer group that have revenue that's less than, I'm going to type a number in, a one with a lot of zeros. Let's see here. How many did I get? 300 million. Let's do $1 billion. So we'll see what happens. I'm going to filter this list, the 930 companies, and click go. And in a little bit of time, I should have companies that have revenue 604. So that is done. And now I'm going to say I'm done, and it's going to populate this list with all those companies. So now I'm going to sort this list by revenue, and I can see here they are. And I'm going to go down this list, and I'm going to just pick one. The one I want to pick that has some good data is probably right around somewhere in here. It was called Flexion. So there it is. There's Flexion. So Flexion Therapeutics. And what I want to do is I want to ask a question about the research and development expenses. So I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to say, okay, give me R&D expenses for the entire group. And it's going to come up. And there's an R&D expense of $54 million. And so you see it here, you can do all kinds of things. You can export this list out. You can, once you get it out into an Excel platform, you can write some ratios on it, whatever it is you want. But you can also do something else inside Calcbench, which I think is really powerful. And that is you can go over here to what we call our analytics page. And you can actually do something we call you can do a common size analysis. So I'm going to pick Flexion with the peer group. And for the period 2020, I'm going to tell you, or the machine is going to tell you, relative to its peers. And of course, you can change the peer group if you want. It's the same group that we collected before. But it's now going to tell you what each of these income statement line items is relative to that peer group when it's deflated by revenue. So you see, for example, R&D expenses, these guys are in the 23rd percentile. And so that is, it looked kind of high when you looked at it this way with the, sorry about that. It was right up here in the, in that area, and we should probably sort by that just to give you an idea. But now you know that it's in the 23rd percentile. You can actually, it won't show up because there are a lot of companies in this, but you can actually get a graph out. And if the graph were well behaved, you'd be able to see what that looked like. These guys spend a lot, but they don't make very much. So that's why that is sort of skewed. But again, we can get that distribution out if that's what you wanted to do. So these are the kinds of things that you can do. And now, I can show people, do we have more time? How much more time do I have?
Yeah, we're okay on time.
Okay. You can do all kinds of other things, like go into footnote disclosures if you want. And I'm going to take this peer group down a lot. I'm actually just going to look at one company, our same group, same company. And you can do things like just simply read the accounting policy, right? And so if you wanted to compare the accounting policy that you've got here with last year's accounting policy, you click on this button, compare text, and that's what it's going to do. Now, this is accounting policy to accounting policy. We even in the back end allow you to go to drill further. So if there's a revenue recognition section of the accounting policy that you only wanted to look at, you could actually do that as well. I'm not going to do that now, but I mean, I can, if somebody wants to get in touch with us and get a demo of that, you could. Client once asked us, if you all are wondering, what the heck is this middle column? A client once asked us to do a delta for them. And so this is what we ultimately all decided on. It's kind of, there are probably better ways to do it, but what you're looking at in the middle, if you see something in green, it means that was added to the statement from 2019 to 2020. And if you see it in red, it means it was deleted. So it can be a little messy, especially when the documents or the sections of the document change significantly. But that's what you're looking at. And again, you know, it isn't just the accounting policy. If they have a, you know, you can look at their income tax footnote, for example, like we said before, and you can get, you know, the reconciliation table here. So you can see what contributed to their effective tax rate of 0.4%. And there it is. And the way our users use a lot of this data is to actually pull out those tables or to pull out specific sections of those tables and then report that back to whatever model building process that they're doing. If they're doing some kind of forecasting, they use those tools, all kinds of things like that.
I can see how the red line on the accounting policies, I know a lot of our customers, they want to, you know, before they adopt, or if they're going to add a disclosure related to a new accounting policy, a lot of times they're going to want to see what their peer group is doing. So
Right.
being able to see that delta really gives them the ability to look at how peers are disclosing that information, so then they can go back to their auditors and they
Right.
have justification for why they disclose something a certain way.
And so you see, to that point, you see down here where it says accounting policies,
Mhm.
that these are all the subsections, right? So if you wanted to go, and I'm going to just pick one, the inventory policy, it may be just in this case, it's 2 paragraphs, but you can actually, you know, there may not be anything that changed from period to period, but you can actually look at that and you can see, yeah, not a single word appears to have changed. But that's the real kind of analytic power that you get when you layer things, when you have a data set in XBRL, and then you've got a you know, you've got a data science approach to accessing that information. So
yeah, and
then,
I can see the value of it and just the speed in which you're able to do this. It's just, I'm trying to think back to, you know, before XBRL data, how all of this would be manually performed on an ad hoc basis. It would
yeah, I mean, you
extremely painful.
Yeah, it's probably people will get really upset. It would be overwhelming, to say the least. I mean, one of my favorite stories. Back when we were starting this thing, I walked into a client's office, and he had a stack of 10Ks on his desk, and he was looking for product warranty accruals, and it was a group of heavy equipment manufacturers, and so that concept really mattered to them when they were analyzing these companies. And so he literally would dig through each statement to pull that data out. And my jaw dropped when I saw this. And when we showed him, look, you can literally get this information out in a few seconds by simply typing, product warranties, right? So like, there are the accruals right there. I don't think you'll have any in the pharma prep group, but to show you, like, or you got one, right? So you can get that information really quickly. But in his industry group, the equipment manufacturers, it was populated quite well. And then one of the other beautiful things you can do here is you don't have to take our word for it. We actually try to find where that piece of information resides in the document. And so what I did was I moused over the number, and people may have seen this word trace pop up. And so when I clicked on the word trace, it took me to the section of the document where it was. And so you see that right there, right? So this should give people confidence that not only are we reporting the information, we're actually pointing you to where it is. And so that's an important element of transparency. And that is something that only the metadata in XBRL provides. So that's really critical.
Well, when you mentioned that stack of papers, the only thing I could think of is how many trees we're saving with the XBRL data analysis.
True story, really happened. Yeah.
Great, well, thank you. You want to kick it back to me and we can continue our discussion?
Happy to. Let me stop my share. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
We can see it.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. So we went through a few examples of how XBRL data can be used. I think we, with the DQC rules and some of the feedback that we've seen over the years about XBRL data, do you see data quality problems with the XBRL data compared to the traditional corporate data?
We do see, in the beginning, we saw a lot of issues, but we're seeing less and less over time. And that's, primarily due to people getting used to the standard, the software vendors getting really much better at helping their own clients. And then a lot of credit should be given to the data quality committee at XBRL US for writing a set of, writing rules over the last 4 or 5 years. And disclaimer, I'm part of that committee, that help filers in getting through those and getting the data quality improved. So more power to them.
Yeah, and I think it's only going to get better as well, because now the DQC rules have actually been added into the SEC Edgar system. So I know as companies adopt the 2021 US GAAP taxonomy, they'll see those DQC validations actually show up on their Edgar submission notification. So I would expect that the quality XBRL data will only improve from here on out. In regards to cover page tags, have you seen that companies are actually using that data?
Yeah, we have seen it. The short answer is yes. They literally use they use all kinds of information. They use you have people going after literally every single data point in a file. Those tend to be the systematic folks. And when I say systematic, some people might think of them as big quantitative investors, but yeah, there's no piece of the document that goes unused. It's kind of scary.
Mm-hmm. Michelle has just indicated that I'm showing the wrong screen, so I apologize for that. We did have a few extra questions that we wanted to handle before we hand it off to Steve. What kind of data do investors find the most use in XBRL format?
So again, they use literally everything, but the investors that we deal with specifically do go into the footnotes. I'm here. Let me just. This I can show people. A lot of investors are very cagey, and they don't let folks, especially the buy side. They don't want folks knowing what they're using, right? Because it's an edge to them, and if they give up their edge, it's a fallacy, right? But if they give up their edge, they're giving up, their crown jewels, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But the sell side is very different, and so I started my video. I don't know if you guys can see this, but this is a Morgan Stanley sell side report on the book tax proposal that's sitting there that the president proposed, and it's sitting there in Congress, I think. I don't know if it'll ever get enacted, but Morgan Stanley wrote an entire research report on it. And they were able to do that research report quickly by citing XBRL data. We're in here like a dozen times. So that's the kind of work that's going on. And this went out to, 1,500 institutional clients that they've got. So that's who's using it. So it's sitting there, it's out there. What more can I say? Yeah.
That's fantastic to hear. I know we're starting to run out of time for our segment. I'll leave you with one more question. I know there's a lot of discussion around ESG data. What are you hearing from your clients, investors? Do you think there really is a demand for this information?
Yeah, we get questions. I won't say every day, but several times a week. We get questions about, what can you tell me about some aspect of ESG, whether it's something like a CEO pay ratio, whether it's, I just blanked on the concept, but there are things in the business description, human capital disclosures.
Yeah.
Yes, we get questions on human capital disclosures, those kinds of things. We get them, I don't know, they're 5 days in a week. We get questions maybe 4 out of the 5 days.
Wow, that's pretty significant.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Pranav. It was a pleasure discussing these topics with you. It's great to see that the XBRL data is being used. I think your demonstration was very helpful to see different ways that we could slice and dice the information and compare data across periods. Really appreciate your time, and thank you to the audience. I'm going to hand it over to Steve, who's going to take it home.
All right, thank you for that, Evan. Let me just share my screen here, and we can take a look at some more features in Inline XBRL. Okay. So everyone should be able to see my screen saying new features of the instance document. Is that correct?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. So continuing on from our discussion that we had last week on this, we're going to talk about transformations now, which is a new feature introduced with Inline XBRL. You're going to see it used an awful lot. Transformations are rules for converting text that appears in a filing to a normalized value. And what that means is that, a lot of the time, the Inline XBRL specification or the XBRL specification expects a certain value type, which is different from what you might traditionally see in a filing. For example, if you have the word spelled out 1 and the tag you're using is a decimal tag or an integer tag, you use a transformation to convert that from a cardinal number to a decimal number. Or if you have a period of time, just 10 years, that's required to be in an ISO format, so a transformation would take that 10 years and turn it into P10Y. And these transformations really just help bridge the gap between, human readable data and machine data. So we need to use these to make that easier. Just because you can use transformations, though, doesn't mean you want to use them all the time. There are ways to define specific custom transformations. You generally don't want to use custom transformations. The SEC has plenty of them available for you to use. And depending on your software vendor you're going with, a lot of these applications will do a lot of this under the hood. So you might not have to get too involved with how this actually works. But here is an example of what a transformation might look like. We can see in the text in the back here, it has the word no, but when you click on it in the SEC's Inline XBRL viewer, it displays as the fact value 0. That's because there is a transformation that will turn anything into a 0, which is useful when you have things like no, none, 0, all spelled out as 0, that sort of thing. Another example might be where you have a dash. Dash doesn't really mean anything to XBRL, but you could turn it into a 0, which would be a valuable data point. You could also use a transformation to convert a dash into a nil fact. Nil fact and a 0 are different things. I see that used interchangeably a lot, but just keep in mind a 0 means you are declaring a value of 0, and a dash or a nil fact is saying that you're not declaring a value, generally because it's not applicable or some other reason. So let's take a look at a couple of the common transformations. There are two main types. There's XBRL transformations in the XBRL transformation registry in the actual specification for XBRL. Then there are also SEC specific transformations. So for example, some of the standard transformations in XBRL would be things like Boolean false, where you take an input of any string and the output type is is false. It just turns anything into false. It doesn't matter what it is. You can do the same with true. And there are a lot of date transformations. For example, you can take specific date formats and it'll just turn it into a standardized date output format. The SEC has their own specialized transformations they use for a lot of these things, like cardinal number transformations, for example. Those are specific from the SEC. You can do cardinal date transformations into actual dates. And there are a lot of quarter end, quarter beginning dates that you can transform as well. And like I said, a lot of this should be handled by your actual software vendor, but depending on how low they actually let you get into the nitty-gritty of your filing, this might be information that is accessible to you. But we'll pause here for some CPE questions from Michelle.
Great, thanks very much, Steve. Okay, we're going to just do 2 quick polls, and I just launched the first one. Which response best represents the type of companies that use financial fundamental data in XBRL format? Is it fund managers and investment analysts, auditors, public companies, or all of the above? Which one do you think is most appropriate? And we'll take about another 30 seconds. All right, just another 15 seconds. All right, we're going to close down this poll and go to our next one. And the correct answer was all of the above. There are many different types of individuals that are using XBRL data today. So I just launched our second poll. Which of the responses below best describes transformations? Is it a method to include required facts in XBRL format without displaying them in the filing? Is it rules for converting text that appears in a filing to a normalized value? Or is it a method to exclude specific text from a non-numeric fact? Which of these best describes transformations? Just another 30 seconds here. Okay, we're going to close down the poll in a few seconds, and I'll tell you what the correct answer is. The correct answer is a transformation is a rule for converting text that appears in a filing to a normalized value. So I'm going to close that down, and I'm going to turn this back over to Steve. Steve, thanks very much.
Thank you, Michelle. So actually, listening to Michelle's questions there, I did want to take it one step back to something else real quick. With transformations, these do have specific inputs and outputs. But if you're looking for a transformation that doesn't exist, for perhaps you have a number formatted in such a way that no transformation exists to convert it, then you would use a hidden fact in order to actually, tag that information. So that would be where you would use a hidden fact if a transformation does not exist. But let's go on to the next section here. So we're going to talk a little bit about dimensions. Now, dimensions are not exactly a new thing. They have been around in traditional XBRL for as long as XBRL has been around. The main difference here is going to be the way they're actually being displayed to the user through the XBRL interface. So dimensions still offer a way to add additional detail or information. They're generally used to split up similar fact categories. So if you have multiple classes of stock or multiple types of property or equipment, you would use an axis or a dimension to separate those things. So what we need to be considerate about here when we're talking about dimensions in Inline XBRL is not so much the difference in how you tag it, but the review process. The inline viewer is going to present these facts differently than the previous viewers might. So be sure that you're considering how you can evaluate dimensional choices in filings going forward. And let's take a look at how this might look in Inline XBRL. Here we have, under a financial statement, we have home building. And we can see that home building, when you click on one of these fact values, will pop up with a member and axis combination. So we can tell that this fact, anything on this section here, is going to be using the axis business segment axis, and it's going to be using the specific member here for Lennar's home building member. So in order to review this, you would have to click on the individual facts in this section and make sure they're appropriately dimensionally tagged. This differs from the older style viewer where you would actually see the facts in a tabular format. In this case, you have to click on the individual facts to look at it if you're using this viewer. We can also drill down to only show highlighted facts. So this could be very helpful if you want to explicitly show only facts that are tagged with a certain axis. Using the tools at the top of the SEC's viewer here, you can set filters. These filters would allow you to do things such as show only facts that are tagged under a certain axis or segment. This allows you to quickly review and say, okay, this entire section of my document is tagged with the correct axis, and then move on. So that's an additional way of viewing you have in the new SEC Inline Viewer. This inline viewer is available freely. Anyone can download it at arel.org, or if your software vendor has a viewer you can use that's similar, you can do that as well. Reach out to whatever software vendor you're using for more information. So traditionally, this is what this usually looked like in regular XBRL. You would see a table. It would show you the domain you're using with the axes underneath that, with any members that you're using underneath that. So this is just contrasting the two different views. The older style view here versus the newer style view in the other tables, the other slides. This older style of view might still be available depending on what software vendor you're going with. So if you want to see it in the older style view, just ask your software vendor. They probably have a reasonable response of how to do this. So now that we've talked about some of the new stuff with the inline document and the instance file and what it allows us to do, let's look at tagging the 10Q cover page, because this is a very common question I get asked. 10Q cover pages, 8K cover pages, they're all tagged in a similar way. The way this is going to work is you would highlight or tag individual facts inline in the document. So the elements you're going to be using have not changed quarter to quarter, taxonomy to taxonomy. They're still the same. So you still have your document type tag, tagging your document type. You still have your document quarterly report and transition report checkboxes with your cover page data that still needs to be tagged. So none of this is changing between Inline XBRL and regular XBRL. Entity registrant name still needs to be tagged. This can be used as a hidden fact if you're tagging a graphic as a number. So if you have a logo showing up on your 10Q and you want to keep that logo there and want to tag it as your company name, you can do that using hidden facts. The address section of a 10Q will look very similar as well. You'll still have all your address information needs to be tagged in line. There is a full set of SEC defined elements you would use for this. You have your incorporation code, tax identification number, all this information is still there. Former address, you can definitely tag as well. If you have multiple former addresses on your cover page, the SEC does provide suggestions for what dimensions you're supposed to use to differentiate them. You would use entity address, address type axis. That way you can differentiate multiple former addresses. The second page is going to use some transformations to tag data. So some of these fields, like entity small business, you would tag a checkbox. Now the checkbox is expecting a Boolean true or false value. So using whatever software you're using to tag these things, it should translate whatever checkbox you're tagging, whether it's a Unicode checkbox, ASCII bracket checkbox, or wingdings. It should understand that and translate it into an appropriate SEC transformation. If you get something along the lines of a lexical pattern mismatch when you file it, that way you know that there's an inappropriate transformation preventing you from submitting the document. One of the potentially more complicated sections of your cover page is going to be the securities portion. So if you have a very simple securities table with just one security on there, it's very easy. You can use your element security 12B title with your trading symbol and your security exchange name. There are a set of expected values the SEC is looking for under the security exchange name. For example, it's looking for NYSE for New York Stock Exchange. If you give it something like New York Stock Exchange all spelled out, there are transformations available to convert what you've given it into an SEC acceptable value. If you're using a non-standard exchange name or something, you might have to use a hidden fact to transform it into an appropriate value. But it can get more complicated if you have multiple different types of security or multiple different exchanges you're reporting for. If you're doing something like that, you might have to get into dimensioning. So no matter what you're tagging, you're still only going to have three elements you use as line items. You have your security 12B, 12G title, your trading symbol, and your security exchange name. But you can differentiate them by using your statement class of stock axis for different classes of stock, or your entity listings exchange axis for different exchanges. You would use these along with either standard members like common stock member for class of stock, or more commonly, you would use custom members to define a specific class of stock or entity exchange axis. The entity exchange axis specifically, the SEC does have a whole taxonomy for like the exchange taxonomy where you can pull members from. For example, you can see here that XNYS for New York Stock Exchange, XCHI is for Chicago Stock Exchange. So where a defined member exists, you should not use a custom member. Want to quickly go through Inline XBRL and the Edgar Filer Manual. It was mentioned before in the initial agenda for this, we're going to talk about changes in the Edgar Filer Manual. They're not so much changes anymore because they've been in there for a while, but if you're not doing Inline XBRL, you could view these as changes. The Edgar Filer Manual goes into a lot of detail on what is required and what is not required for this, and I definitely recommend that anyone who is interested in doing this take a look at the Edgar Filer Manual. So for example, there's a whole section on transformations that are available and how these transformations work. So you can see like Boolean ballot box transforms Unicode checkboxes into Boolean values, or the exchange name transformation transforms exchange names into the expected values. So this will give you a clear idea of what inputs are being expected and what outputs are going to be generated. Chapter 6 of the Edgar Filer Manual, or Section 6, also goes into a lot of detail about which elements require visible facts. So if you're doing like an 8K, for example, you might not require all of the same things that you would require on a 10Q or a 10K. This particular section goes through and lists out which elements are required, and it tells you when they're required. So you would learn from this section that the public float is only required to be tagged on a 10K, for example. The securities elements section in Chapter 6 also goes over these elements you're allowed to use for tagging securities tables and talks about what elements you could use in case there is no trading symbol. So for example, if no trading symbol is defined, you would just define the element no trading symbol flag as true. That would allow you to tag more than just the standard case. This section also lists what elements you're supposed to use for axes if you have multiple classes of stock or if you have multiple securities. The Edgar Filer Manual here also makes it clear that if you're using dimensions, you have to use dimensions for every row. I can't do one row for my securities table with no dimensions and then the next row with dimensions. I have to be consistent and use the same dimensions, or at least the same axes throughout the table. It also has a similar section for multiple exchanges. It allows you to go through and just take a look to see what exchange elements you can use, what taxonomies you can use. There's also a section on address elements. These address elements, the requirements differ depending on the document you're filing. For example, a 20F has address requirements for contacts in the United States or local contacts, whereas a 10Q wouldn't have requirements for that. So if you're a foreign filer, you'd want to pay careful attention to this section of the document and look at the address requirements. These requirements are also obvious if you try to test file something to the SEC. The accession notice you get back will generally spell out what elements are missing, but I personally like to, review the rules before I submit a filing rather than trusting the SEC's Edgar system to tell me what's required. And of course, there's standard cover page documents in this section as well, which requirements vary pretty greatly report to report, whether you have to define any of these or not. So this Chapter 6 of the Edgar Filer Manual is very valuable. 20F cover pages have some additional elements as well. There's not too much that's specific only for 20F, but there are a couple in this particular section that if you are a foreign filer who's going to be filing a 20F, is definitely worth your time to review this section. And again, I mentioned that there are different address reporting requirements for foreign filers. 6.5 of the EFM goes into great detail on what requirements exist for you and what elements you have to include. For a lot of these, if they are missing from your report, it will generally generate a warning on the Edgar system, which is not suspendable, but it's still highly recommended that you meet those requirements. And we have cover page tagging as well. For 8Ks specifically, you have your written communications, soliciting materials, and the other check boxes you would see on the 8K cover page as standardized elements. We also have former address elements in here, as we discussed before. If you have to use multiple former addresses, you can use the entity address, address type axis with the former address member to define different axes. So let's talk about some best practices for doing this then. You want to use the SEC's XBRL renderer in your review process. It can definitely help you drill down to see what facts are being tagged, make sure everything is tagged correctly, make sure the precision is tagged correctly on things, that you're not excluding any important facts from your document. You're going to want to compare your prior filing to the extracted XBRL instance document to make sure that your documents are at least comparable. You don't want to have any huge changes going forward in what elements you're using. And you definitely need to consider your process change, because this is going to be a process change going from standard XBRL to inline XBRL. You need to plan how you're going to review your document, because the document review process should change. You need to make sure that you have a review checklist that identifies every important point that you're going to need to hit. Whether you're doing this yourself or whether you're outsourcing your document, the review process is going to be very important to make sure you have that nailed down before you're submitting to the SEC. You also want to make sure you pay careful attention to the XBRL US data quality rules. As mentioned earlier in the presentation here, those are being included in the actual Edgar system now. So when you file to the SEC, if you are violating any of the DQC rules, you'll get a warning about that. The biggest one I've seen, for example, is using negative elements incorrectly, like having negative cache, which doesn't make too much sense. You also want to consider how complex your conversion is and how much time you need to take for this. So if you're having a very complex filing with thousands of elements, you might want to allow some additional lead time in order to adapt to this process. If you have a very simple document with just a couple hundred facts, you're probably fine I still recommend, doing it ahead of time, but it shouldn't be too much of a burden to figure out how you're going to do this. So make sure you consider the complexity of your filing. And if you are going to be using an outsourcing vendor, you want to make sure that you discuss this with them ahead of time. You need to know what they're going to be responsible for and what you're going to be responsible for, how the review process is going to change. You might need to make changes to tagging and how things are being handled if something doesn't translate into Inline XBRL very well. You want to make sure you're aware of that. And you also need to take into consideration training. I know we're getting closer and closer to the deadline now, but there is still time. If people need to be trained on Inline XBRL, there is plenty of time before the deadline. Do that if you take that into consideration starting now. But I'm going to turn it back to Michelle now for another set of CPE questions.
Steve, thanks very much. Yeah, let's go through our final CPE questions. And I'm going to launch the polling here. Okay, so the next question is, which list below best represents where SEC filers can find transformations that they can use in US GAAP filings? Is it the Edgar Filer Manual and the XBRL Transformation Register? Is it the Edgar Filer Manual, the FASB Transformation Registry, and the XBRL Transformation Registry? Or is it the Edgar Filer Manual? Which one is the most appropriate response? We'll get about another 30 seconds here. Okay, we're going to close down the poll in just a minute here. And the correct response is the Edgar Filer Manual and the XBRL Transformation Registry. So those are the two sources that you should look for transformations. Okay, we're going to go to the next poll, final poll. Which of the following are new elements that need to be tagged with the SEC cover page tagging requirements? Is it the company name, the type of form, class of security, or trading symbol? Which is a new element that needs to be tagged with the SEC cover page tagging requirements? Okay, just another 30 seconds on this question. Okay, I think we're going to close the poll down now. And the correct response was class of security is a new element that needs to be tagged with the SEC cover page tagging requirements. So I want to thank all of our speakers today. I want to thank our attendees for coming, and big thanks to Pranav and Evan for their discussion at the start of the session, explaining why small company data in XBRL format is so widely used. And really big thanks to Steve Horowitz from NovaWorks. Steve did a great job both on a session this week and the one last week, giving us an overview of all the changes that need to be made as you move into the phase 3, the final phase of the SEC rollout for inline XBRL and cover page tagging. So thanks again to everybody for attending today. And if you missed part of the program, or you have a colleague who did, we will be posting a replay for the program in the next couple of days and sending that out to everybody. And thanks again.